In this lecture we'll be completing the walls by joining the wall piece to the pillars. So here's where we got up to last time, and I'm in object mode for the wall. And we can duplicate this wall section here and create 3 different types of walls with our 3 different pillars. Now to complete our wall module, we will only need to join the wall to one pillar on one side, because when we duplicate it, it creates the other pillar on the other side. At times you will need a spare pillar to go on the end of your wall in case it doesn't join up to the start. So with that in mind, I'll come to top view and I'll duplicate each of my pillars. So Shift D, Y, 4 to move that backwards out of the way. And this one I'll turn snapping on, so snapping up here. And if I click on the drop down, I've got it set to increment, which is the grid. So I can Shift D to duplicate and move that one just above like this. So it snaps to the grid. The same with this one, Shift D to duplicate and move it up to the top here. And lastly, the same with my wall, Shift D to duplicate up to here, and once again, and once again. So I've got 3 wall modules here. Now you might notice as I move around, there's a tiny bit of flicker where the wall module overlaps the pillar. If I zoom in, we can't actually see that, but you can see that it's very, very close, and that's causing what's called the Z fighting, where the 2 faces overlap too close to each other, and at distances, we get the flicker. To solve that, I'm going to select all my pillars and go into edit mode, face mode, and select those top faces and just move them up very slightly. So I'll move into around here, G then Z. Oh, I've got to turn off my snapping, and then G then Z to move those upwards. Just so there's a nice gap there. Let's zoom back out into object mode, and you can see we've lost that flicker. So quickly pause the video and catch up with me, creating your duplicates of the walls and pillars, and also select the top face of the pillars. Just move it up slightly so we don't get that flicker. Pause the video and have a go at that. Okay, so there's a couple of ways of joining objects together. There's just a simple join with Ctrl J, which I'll talk about in a moment. There's also the option of Boolean. We'll talk about how to Boolean objects later. It's a little bit more complicated and you get a few problems as beginners, so we're going to do it nice and simply with just a join. And I'll explain the differences later on. So I'll click on my wall here and my pillar here, and I want to join the 2 together. Now I'm choosing the pillar last because the pivot point of the pillar is in a really nice position that I can duplicate and snap to the grid and create my walls nice and easily, as you can see in this example. So by selecting that last, it becomes the active object which we join our objects to. Hence the wall will be joined to that pillar. So the join command is Ctrl J, and if I press that now, I lose half of my wall. They are one object though, so if I select this object and press G to grab, it's all one object. And if I go to the outliner, incidentally I can press the period key, which will zoom in on that object, and there's my single object. However, we've only got half of the wall. That's because the wall had a mirror modifier, and once it was joined to the pillar, it now has the pillar's modifiers, which are none. So it's disappeared. So I'll undo the join, select on my original wall, and I need to apply the modifier before joining. This could be seen as a disadvantage to this method. It is destructive modeling because we have to apply our modifier, and it becomes awkward to get it back if we want to. But we can apply our modifiers by coming up to the drop down here, and apply is there, Ctrl A is the keyboard shortcut. Now I've applied that and shift select my pillar, and that's the active object. Now when I press Ctrl Join, they are joined together as one object, and I can now press Shift D, X4 and create a duplicate wall module, Shift D, X4 and then RZ90, and I can go around a corner. But I'll delete those for now and give you the challenge of joining your walls to your pillars. Do remember to apply the mirror modifier. Pause the video and have a go at that. Okay, so I can now select the next one, come over to my modifiers, Ctrl A to apply that, Shift select my pillar and Ctrl J to join. And the last one, Ctrl A to apply my modifier, Shift select my pillar and Ctrl J to join. So hopefully you've gotten okay with that. Now I'll quickly isolate this object by going to local view and go into edit mode, and it looks like a really nice join, and you can see these objects are joined together. But if I come around to the bottom here, you can see that we've still got these faces here, and we've got a bit of overlap here. Let's go into wireframe, and you can see that all those faces on the inside here still exist. I'll deselect those. It's a little bit tricky to see, but this object has lots of inside faces. Having inside faces like this is absolutely fine, but it isn't as efficient as if we join them together as one complete mesh. And if I go back to object mode, as if this was joined together nicely and there was an actual edge coming down here cutting them apart. If we want to join them together with no inside faces, that's where we would use a Boolean. Having said that, if I go into object mode and Shift D to duplicate in the X4 and press enter, every time you create a new module like this, you are overlapping your geometry. And this is really common in world building, that you create using modules like this that overlap slightly. So the loss of performance is really minimal, and for speed's sake, it's much quicker to just join them together like we've done here. So I'll undo that duplication and come out of local view, and we now have 3 separate wall modules. It'd be a great idea to put these into a collection, so I'll select them all, move to new collection, walls. The original here, I might want to keep. Because it's got the mirror modifier, I might want to adapt it and change it. I'll also want to use it for a door opening at some point as well. So what I usually do is move that to a new collection, so M to move to new collection, and I always have a collection called spares, which are the originals and things like that, and objects I'm not sure whether I'll need them again, and press OK. I'll just expand the outliner for a moment, and I always hide the spares from the viewport and hide it from the render so they don't cause any confusion. So the last thing for you to do then is to catch up with me and put your walls into a collection and your original wall into a spares or originals collection so that we can access it if we need to. Once you've done that, make sure you saved your work, ready for next time. In this lecture, we'll be creating the door surround for our doorway module. Okay, so here's where we got up to last time. And in order to create a door, I need to bring back my wall, which is in my spares in the outliner on the right here. So I'll make that visible and I'll select it and duplicate it across to the side here. So Shift D, X, so it's out of the way here. And I'll hide the original. And I'll move this out of the spares and into my main collection. I won't create a new collection just yet until I've made all the pieces. I'll use this pillar for the door pillars. So Shift D, X, and then 2. And then Shift D, X, and then 4. For the final module, I'll remove one, but whilst we're making it, it's good to have one on either side to make sure things are lining up. And for those two, I'll also move those into the main collection. I can then hide my pillars and hide my walls and work just on this door section here. So I'll move on that. So now's a good time to catch up with me and create a duplicate of your wall and 2 pillars ready for our doorway. So I want to create a stone door coming around here, and to do that I'll start with a plane, draw the outline of the door, and then I'll extrude it backwards. I'll show you what I mean. So Shift right click to move my 3D cursor, Shift A to add, mesh, and then plane. Now remember, you can add the rotation in here. So I can add a 90 degree in the X-axis rotation and press enter. That way it's facing my camera and makes it a little bit easier. I'll also change the size so it's only 1 meter. So it's roughly the size of one of these stones. Now I'll go into front view and position that into place, somewhere around there, and obviously we're going to mirror it across the other side. So I'll come across the properties panel and move that up slightly into my modifier properties, add modifier, mirror. Now of course it looks like nothing's happened because it's just mirroring around that object origin there, so we need to move the object origin. So pause the video here and catch up with me and add your plane to one side of your wall module. Also, see if you can remember how to move the object origin. Pause the video and have a go at that. So I'll come up to the options, choose Effect Only Origins, G, X, and then move it across into the middle there. So now we can see our mirror. Now I'll come in a little bit, turn off the Effect Only Origins and into edit mode with Tab and start making my wall. I think it needs to be a touch smaller, so I'll scale it down. And I'll press G and G to grab and move it so it's just below the floor line there. That way we won't see any gaps. And I'll go to edge mode with 2, select the top edge and E to extrude and bring that upwards. I'll keep it in the Z axis for now, E to extrude again, and I'll rotate this one and E to extrude again and bring it into the middle. Now it's overlapping there, so I need to turn on clipping. And once I turn that on and bring it backwards so it sticks in the middle there, and then forwards so it sticks in the middle at the top. I'll go into vertex mode now and start editing this. Now obviously my door's way too thin, so I can select all these and bring them out. And this is why I use a plane instead of a cube, because I only have one side of vertices that I need to edit. With a cube, I'd have to be selecting the back ones all the time as well. I'm going to select this one here and move it upwards, and then Control B to bevel to create another brick like this. I'll move this one upwards Remember, this is all one brick at the top here, so we can move that down and make it look like a brick. And I'll just edit the shape slightly until I'm happy with how it looks. So somewhere around there, I think. Let's just have a quick look around and make sure I'm fairly happy with that. So pause the video here and make one side of your wall like this. And now I want the same shape on the other side at the back here, so it goes all the way through my wall. To do that, I can mirror in the y-axis as well. So if I tick on the y here, you can see it appears down here. Have a quick think why that is. So if I go into object mode with tab, press N to get my tools and go into item, you can see we've got that X rotation, which we need to apply. Try and remember the keyboard shortcut to apply the rotation. So that's Control A to apply the rotation, and suddenly it disappears from down here and we still can't see it. But if I go to top view, we can see that our object origin is just here. So again, it's mirroring right on top of itself. So again, in object mode, I'm going to come up to the options, effect only origins, G then Y, and I can pull that into the middle around here. And we should see one on the back now and one on the front. So I'll go back into edit mode and you can see we're only modeling one corner, but we're mirroring along the X and along the Y. So it makes it a lot quicker. So pause the video and catch up with me and mirror in the Y axis and move your object origin so it's in the middle of the wall piece. Pause the video and have a go at that. Okay, so now I want to join the back and the front up. So I can go to edge mode with 2, select this row of edges here, so Alt left click to select them, and Shift Alt left click to select the edges on the outside, and I can press E to extrude in the Y and extrude them backwards. Now I can't see how far I'm going, so I'll just extrude them a little bit, isolate my shape with / on the numpad. I've got clipping turned on, so I can just press G then Y and they should stick together in the middle there. I'll left click to set that, and we've got a nice door surround, and I'll press / to come out of local view. Now we've got a bit of Z fighting there. If I come back a little bit, you can see a little bit of flicker around the base here. So if I select all and press G to grab in the Y, we can bring those out very slightly so they're not right on top of the other ones. Okay, so extrude those edges out and join them up with the back faces to kind of make our door whole. Pause the video and have a go at that. Okay, lastly, let's separate the bricks out. This brick's a little bit tall compared to these ones, so I might just select that edge loop there and this one here, G to grab in the Z and move those down a bit, probably somewhere around there. And I'll select this edge loop as well and this one here as well with Shift Alt left click, and I can bevel these with Control B to bevel. So I'm turning them into bricks, and I'll use the wheel of my mouse to create an extra loop in there and left click to set. Now I can come in and select each of these and scale them in. Now at the moment they're scaling into one another, so they're taking that sort of medium point there. So I'll undo that, have a quick think of what I need to change in order to make them scale on their individual origins. So hopefully you remembered you can come up to here, which is the transform pivot points, and change it to individual origins. Now if I scale, it will go inwards again on their individual origins. Now I'm just going to go into local view to show you something that may seem a bit confusing to start off with. If I come around to the top here, that scaling this edge around here has gone in this way a little bit further than it has into this way in the Y. That's because it's finding the middle point of these three edges, this one, and this one. So the middle point is actually not over here, it's in the middle of the shape over here. So this one doesn't move as far as these do. I'll press Ctrl Z a few times to go back to having them all selected. I can actually just press G to grab in the Y and move them in manually this way to make up for the difference. So pressing G then Y will pull all these edges in. Obviously these ones are stuck here, so it seems as if they don't move, but these edges here will move in the Y. So pause the video here and create your brick structure using the bevel and scaling in the individual origins. And remember, you may have to grab in the Y-axis to move them backwards slightly as well to compensate for their object origin. Okay, so I'll go back to object mode, back out of isolation mode, and I'll also turn off the effect only origins so we can see our door there. Your challenge now is to add some notches and wobble or distortion to the door, so by maybe cutting into your shape and beveling a few vertices. However, you must remember to apply your mirror before doing that. So pause the video and have a go at that. Okay, so hopefully you remembered how to apply the mirror. We can come across to our modifiers and either press Ctrl A or come to the drop down and click on apply. I'll go into local view for this and into edit mode. I'll go into vertex mode and add a few bevels. So I'll select a few of these on either side and Ctrl Shift B to bevel vertices. And I'll use the wheel of my mouse so I don't have an extra cut, and around there looks good. Now these vertices are very close to each other and I can go around pressing GG to edge slide them into each other and they will merge together as long as I've got the auto merge vertices turned on. However, I can select all and press M to merge and then by distance. And it's removed my 7 vertices because they were just close enough there. If they're not quite close enough, you can turn this up 1, but don't turn it up too far, otherwise you'll get vertices merging into each other that are a bit further away. So just bring it up a tiny bit if you need to and wait for that message down there to tell you that you've removed your vertices. So that's a nice quick way of merging those. So that's the bevels. I could create a few loop cuts, so Ctrl R across here and maybe one down the bottom here and select on maybe that edge and that one there. Now I'm not getting one across here because that's an end gone. So I need to finish it off with the knife tool, press K and left click there to the end and press enter. And now I can select that one and Ctrl B to bevel and V for vertex, bring those out like that. And remember to select these two and press J to join. Same goes for this one. I can do an edge slide to create a bit more of a notch like that, or it can be a thinner one like that. So I'll just quickly put another one in here. So again, Ctrl B to bevel and select the two verts and join them together. I might do one over here as well. So Ctrl R. Again, that loop cut's not going all the way around. So instead of doing a loop cut, I'll escape from that. I'll go to front view, select all and use the bisect tool. So that's down here, click and hold and choose bisect and then create a cut across there. Now this is a bit awkward because it's doing the base as well. That's okay. I could of course just use the knife tool instead, but I'll use the bisect to show you that it's okay. Remember, you've got to have fill, clear inner and clear outer deselected, so it just creates a cut. I'll go back to my selection tool now so there's no confusion, and I want to get rid of these edges down here. So into edge mode, Alt left click to select that edge loop and go to my delete menu and dissolve edges. The shortcut for that, by the way, is Ctrl X. Now I can come up to the top to vertex mode, Ctrl Shift B to bevel and create a cut in there and select these two and J to join. I can then press GG to edge slide and I could go all the way to the other one there and create a notch like that. Lastly, I'll select all with A, mesh, transform and randomize. Bit too much, so as usual we go to something like 0.01. Now I don't want the bottom vertices to be affected by that, so I'll undo that, deselect the bottom vertices so they're not selected, and go up to mesh again, transform and randomize. And again change this to 0.01. Now we have our door looking quite nice. I'll add a little bit more to the back here, so I'll just speed this process up. So just beveling a couple more vertices. And there we have it, our doorway. So hopefully you got an okay with that. Do make sure you save your work ready for next time. In this lecture, we'll be cutting a hole into our wall and joining it together to make a door opening. I'll also be explaining a small amount about Boolean techniques. Okay, so here's where we got up to last time, and I'll come out of local view so we can see our wall in the background here, and we've got our door surround here. And we obviously need to cut a hole in the wall so that we can get through our doorway. Now there's a couple of ways of doing this. We can quite simply cut a shape into the wall using the knife tool and then delete the faces in the middle where we want the hole. Or we could do a Boolean operation. A Boolean operation, as shown here, is where we add a separate object and we use that to cut the hole in our wall in this case. Boolean operations can be a little bit glitchy and in my opinion aren't really suitable for a beginner because of all the difficulties that you can have. It takes a little bit of experience to know how to get over those glitches, and it would take a fair bit of time in these beginner exercises to make sure that we covered all those possible problems. For now, what's more important is that you get used to the box modeling techniques of manipulating vertices, faces and edges, and getting more experience with the basic tools. So to start with, I'm going to select these two pillars and press H to hide. That way it won't get confusing. And that's the same as selecting the eye over here in the outliner on the right. Now I can select my wall and go into wireframe. I can come up to here and choose wireframe, or I can press Z or Z and I get a pie menu of those views and I can choose wireframe from there. It's a little bit quicker to get used to that Z command. Now I can go into front view. I'll zoom in just a touch. And I'll also press 5 to come out of orthographic mode. That way I can easily see the edges. I'll go into edit mode, K for the knife tool, and I can start cutting into my shape. And the main thing is for me to create an area in the middle here where I can delete the faces. I can actually use some of the edges that have already been made. So I could, for example, select from here, so left click, and come up to this point here, which you can see there, and press enter. I can select all these faces and delete them in here, round to here. So I just need to create another cut down from here. So K for knife tool, and come down from there to there. Now I can go in and select the faces, so I can choose face mode with 3 and select any faces that I don't need. And I'm just going around box selecting. You can actually change your selection tool. If I click and hold on the selection tool over here, I can choose circle select. That way I can hold down shift and kind of paint by holding down my left mouse button, or hold down control and paint to get rid of any faces that I want to keep. Do make sure you change back to the select box so it doesn't get confusing. At this point, once I've got all these faces, I can press delete and then faces. And that has created a hole in my wall. When I go back to solid mode, so Z, solid mode, we can see we've got a nice hole in the wall there. And the faces I deleted, because we've got the mirror modifier on, have mirrored to the back along the y-axis. And if I bring my 2 pillars back, we've got a nice wall module. I'll just come back into object mode. So pause the video here and catch up with me, cutting a hole into your wall section. Remember, you can use the edges that are already there to make a hole. And once you've done that, delete the faces. Pause the video and have a go at that. And your challenge is to make this into a wall module, joining the pieces together. Do remember you only need 1 pillar. Also remember to apply your mirror, and do think about your active object and therefore which object you are joining the other objects to. Pause the video and have a go at that. So in order to join them together, I can delete this end pillar because we don't need it anymore. So select that and press delete. And I'll select the middle part of the wall and make sure I apply the mirror. So move my mouse across the right hand side over the modifiers and press Ctrl A to apply the modifier. Then I need to select my door surround, my wall, and this pillar last. That means that will be the active object. It's highlighted yellow, so we know it's the active object. And the object origin will be over here. So it'll be nice and easy to position this and duplicate it. So with those selected, I can press Ctrl J to join, and they're all joined together. So hopefully you got an okay with that. Just a reminder, as I was previously saying, if I go into wireframe, so Z, wireframe, we can see that we've still got some inside faces. So this is not the most optimal way of doing it, but those inside faces won't make a lot of difference. So Z to go back into solid mode, and we've got our doorway all ready to go. So as always, make sure you've saved your work, ready for next time. In this lecture, we'll be reminding ourselves of material slots by adding materials to the walls, and I'll talk about different methods of selecting your faces within edit mode. Okay, so here's where we got up to last time, and I'll zoom out a touch, and let's bring back the pillars and walls, and we'll go across to the shading workspace. I'll move a bit so we can see all our objects. And before shading the objects, I think the layout could do with a bit of adjustment. We're not really using these windows over here, and the principal BSDF is quite long and thin, so it makes sense to have 2 windows, one with the shader editor on this side and one with the viewport on this side. So what I'll do is I'll bring this out to around about here, come over to the corner here where my cursor changes and click and drag to join these 2 together, and change this up the top left here to the shader editor. That brings up this side window which we don't need. I'll press N to get rid of that, and I can zoom in on my principal BSDF just there, which I think makes it a little bit easier. So I want to keep the 3D viewport, so I can click and drag in the corner here over my shader editor, and I've got a much bigger window now to select my objects and edit them in here. I'll just bring this across a tiny bit more so I can just see my material name. So pause the video and catch up with me and adjust the shading workspace so it's similar to mine. Okay, now I don't really need my pillars showing anymore because they are actually joined to these wall modules. So I'll bring down the outliner and hide the pillars. Let's start with the first wall module here. I'll zoom in on that with period key, go into edit mode so I can start thinking about which faces I want to assign certain colors to. Now this gray material we have is absolutely fine, but I'd like to have a different color maybe for the stones. But I've got a slight issue trying to select just those faces. And I'll move across my menu at the top here with middle mouse button and turn on X-ray view. So I can select faces in the background, but I can also see the color of my objects. And incidentally, that is Alt-Z will turn the X-ray mode off and on. And I've got a slight difficulty selecting, let's say, just the pillar if I wanted to give that a color, or isolate the wall. So I'll press Alt A to deselect all, because these aren't actually joined, although they are joined in the sense that they're one object, but they're not joined through their edges and vertices. I can press L over one of these objects, and that's select linked. So all the vertices that are linked together will be selected, and therefore only the wall object. You have got lots of options in your drop down as well, but many of these you won't understand yet, but just be aware that that's there. Now this is okay if I wanted to assign all the wall faces to one material and all the pillar faces to another, but what if I wanted to separate out these faces in the middle and have the top and bottom as a different color? Well, I can press Ctrl I, which is select inverse, and you can find that in the select menu up the top here, so select and invert. That will select just the pillar, and I can press H to hide. Now I can go to front view. I've got the other pillars in the background, so I'll just isolate this shape with / so it goes into local view, and then I can select just the middle faces here. I'll zoom in a touch. I've actually got this face here and at the top selected as well, and on the other side. So I can press Ctrl- to shrink the selection, and now I've only got the bricks. Again, that option is under the select more or less, and that's Control numpad minus just there. So now I can assign these middle faces to a new material. So I'll come up to my slots, add a new slot, and I can assign them straight away, and they turn white because that's the default if you haven't got any material. I'll create a new material though, and I'll call it grey and then light. I choose that instead of light grey because when I click on the drop down, it's alphabetical, so they'll be next to each other. And I can change this to a light grey, somewhere probably around here. I'll just quickly go into object mode to see it without any distraction, and that looks quite nice. I'll just bring it down a little bit more though, just around there. Okay, so it's time to catch up with me and give the stones within the wall section a lighter grey material slot. Pause the video and have a go at that. Okay, so back into edit mode, and you can see it's still got the pillar over here hidden. So just be aware of that. When you jump back into object mode, you can see the whole object again, but when in edit mode, it remembers your preference for which bits are hidden and which bits aren't. So I can press Alt H to unhide objects. Remember, Alt is kind of the reverse of commands. I can deselect all with Alt A, and let's say I wanted to give the pillar stones some color. This time I'll select my wall first, so press L over the wall part and press H to hide. 1 to go to front view, and let's select these faces and these faces here. So these two stones are going to have a separate color, and I've just missed one there, so I'll just select that as well. So just have a quick check around, make sure you have got them all selected, and then I can go up to my slots, and I've already got 2 slots there because remember, slots are for the whole object. The pillar and the wall are both joined as a whole object, even though they're not linked. And I can select the light grey, and I can assign these faces to the light grey. Now I'll press Alt H to bring back the rest of my wall, and press Tab to come out of edit mode, and I've got some different coloured stones there, and it creates a much more interesting object. So pause the video here and assign the grey light material to some of your stones. It can look different to mine, that's absolutely fine, but just practice those techniques. Pause the video and have a go at that. Okay, lastly, you can see that it's a little bit shiny, so I'm just going to bring up the roughness to somewhere around 0.8 like I normally do. And let's come out of local view with / so I can see my other wall modules. Your challenge then is to texture the other wall modules and the door opening using the grey material we've already got and the light grey material to add some variation across those objects. So pause the video and have a go at that. Okay, so I'll show you the process once again with the doorway module because that's the most complicated. I'll zoom in on that with period key. I'll go into local view with the object with / on my numpad, into front view, into edit mode. I'll press Alt A to deselect all, make sure there's no other faces selected, and let's start with the door surround by pressing L on that object. I'll create a new material slot, so under slots, click on the plus sign and assign these faces. They all turn white because we've got no material selected, and I can come up to the top here and select my grey light material. Let's just go into object mode and see what that looks like, and we can see that's assigned to those faces. So back into edit mode, back into front view. I can hide that shape by pressing H. I'll press L over the pillar and hide that shape as well, and select these faces in here. Just remember there's those ledges just here and at the top, so I can press Ctrl- to shrink my selection. So I've just got those bricks, and again, up to the top here, and assign those faces to the light grey. Alt H to bring back all my objects, Alt A to deselect all, and I'll select my door surround and my wall by pressing L, then L again. And a quick note there, you don't have to hold down Shift. You can just press L over those different objects and it will add to that selection. And press H to hide. Into front view, select these faces and these faces at the bottom here as well. Just check that they are definitely only those selected. And once again, up to the slots and assign those to the light grey. Alt H to bring back my other objects, Tab to come out of edit mode, and there we have it, my door opening with those different bricks. I'll deselect my object with Alt A and come out of local view with / on my numpad, and I'll add materials to the other ones. Now it's worth pointing out that this pillar here is the same as this one at the end here, and we'll need to use that wall module as the other side to this wall here. And in fact, I'll show that by coming to top view, pressing Alt D to make a link duplicate, and if I hold down Control, that turns snapping on, so I can snap it into position and left click there. So that's the snapping tool up here, and you can hold down Control to enable it when you're moving objects. But just remember that it will use the snapping that's set in this drop down. So at the moment it's increment, which is the grid, which is what we want. So if it was set to any of the other ones, such as face, and I pressed G to grab and held down Control, it would start snapping to these other objects. So I'll undo that and change it back to increment. Now if I come around here, you can see that we need this pillar on the other side of the door so that these two pillars match. So the changes in color I make for this pillar need to match this one over here. So I can do that on either of these two objects now because they're linked. So I'll choose this one, go into local view, into edit mode, into front view, L to select my wall and H to hide. Select these areas in my pillar, make sure I've definitely got those ones selected. Create a new material slot, assign it, and choose that grey light material. Alt H to reveal the hidden, Alt A to deselect all, L to select my pillar and H to hide. Into front view, I'll zoom in a touch and select those middle faces. Remember you've got those ledges as well, so Control- to deselect those. And up to my slots, I've already got my grey light because I did it for my pillar on this object, so I can assign the grey light there. Back into edit mode, out of local view, and we've got that wall module there. So I'll just very quickly do the last one, zoom in on that with period key, into local view, tab into edit mode, into front view, Alt A to deselect all, L to select the wall and H to hide. Select these. Again, you can have it very different if you like. Just make sure I've got those selected, create a new material slot, assign my faces to it, and choose grey light. Alt H to reveal hidden, Alt A to deselect all, select my pillar and hide it, into front view, select those middle faces, Control- to make sure I don't have those ledges, and once again assign those to the grey light material. Alt H to reveal hidden, tab to come out of edit mode, and / to come out of isolation mode, and I've got all my wall modules ready to make a dungeon. So hopefully you got an okay with that. As always, make sure you've saved your work, ready for next time. In this lecture, we'll be making some floor tiles with broken tiles on top of to create some variation around the dungeon floor. So here's where we got up to last time, and in order to create the floor modules, it would be a nice idea to map out a small room so we can see what they're going to look like and how they might work together. So I can choose any of my 3 different walls here to make up this room. I've already used this pillar, so perhaps I'll use a different pillar this time for the rest of the walls. I'll go into top view and press Alt D to create a linked duplicate, and remember to hold down Control and you can snap it into position, and left click. You may actually want to turn snapping on, which is up here in the middle, as it's a touch easier than always holding down Control. So with this module we just placed here, I'll press R90, that will rotate it 90 degrees in the Z axis of course, and we've got the start of a corner of our room. So back to top view, and I'll carry this on around the room. So Alt D, move it into position, and just keep doing that. Of course, at the end here, R90 will go around the corner. I could have another doorway here perhaps, so I could duplicate this doorway. So Alt D, move that to here, R180, and move that into position. And then for the other side, I'll need this pillar here, so I'll use this wall module here. Back to top view, Alt D, move that into position, R180, and then go back to these modules here, which have that different pillar. Alt D, R90, Alt D, And a useful tip here is if I press Shift R, that repeats the last action. So my last action was to duplicate this one and move it over here. So by repeating that last action, it did exactly the same thing here. Now I can't press it again because I did select this one and then went back to this one. So I'll have to just press Alt D this time and move it into position. But that might speed things up if you have a really long wall. You can just press Shift R to repeat the last action. So we've got ourselves a nice looking room with 2 doorways, and that looks great. So pause the video and create a room for yourself. You can have the doorways in different positions if you like. Make sure it's at least this big because I want to talk about floor tiles, but it can be bigger if you like. So pause the video and have a go at that. Okay, for the next bit, I'll go back to the layout workspace and I'll come into top view. And for a floor module, I press Shift A to add, mesh, and then plane. And we want it to be 4 meters by 4 meters. So I'll type in 4 here, and that creates our plane 4 by 4. However, because of the positioning of it, it's actually difficult to snap to the grid. If I press G to grab now, it is snapping to the grid, but it's keeping its location in the middle of the grid, if that makes sense. So because it placed it in where the 3D cursor is, it's not quite on the grid. Now what I could have done is reset my 3D cursor back to the world origin. You can do that with Shift S to bring up the pie menu for the 3D cursor, and you've got cursor to world origin there. That will bring it back to the origin. And then Shift A to add, and then I could have added the plane in that way. But I'll escape that. I can just, with my plane selected, remove any movement. So select these 3, press 0, and that will move it back to the center of the grid. So rather than applying the movement, I'm clearing the movement so it goes back right into the center. So back to top view. Now when I press G to grab, it's snapping to the grid and I can place my first floor module in the corner there. So catch up with me and add in a floor module and place it somewhere into your room like I have here. Okay, so it's a good idea to have a few floor modules, so we've got a bit of variation across our floor. And rather than just having a completely plain floor, it's nice to put some kind of tiles in there, maybe broken tiles, and that can break up the whole of the floor and make it look a little bit more organic and natural. So what I'm going to do is create some broken floor tiles and join them with a floor module. So to do that, I'll come back to the world origin, Shift A to add, mesh, and then cube. And I'll scale this right down in the Z axis so it's fairly flat like this. And I want it fairly small, so I'll scale it down a bit further. And this will be the first of my tiles. And I'm going to edit this slightly so it's got some chipped corners, maybe have some smaller ones in there and things like that. So I'll go into edit mode and I'll go into top view and zoom in a touch. And I'll go into X-ray mode. That way, if I go to edge mode, I can select an edge. I know that edge is selected even though I can't see it very well because I've box selected it. So back to top view and then press Ctrl B to bevel, and it's got a chipped corner of this tile. I can select the other corner here, Ctrl B to bevel, maybe a little bit further. This one here, Ctrl B to bevel, and a little bit less. And maybe this one, a fair bit more. And I can adjust the shape if I want by maybe selecting these and pressing G to grab. Oh, I've still got snapping turned on, so I'll turn snapping off just there, and maybe this corner here, G to grab into about there, and we've got ourselves a kind of tile shape. And you can adapt this accordingly. Maybe I'll select this edge here. Again, it's tricky to see that you've got an edge selected when you select them like this, but you can just about see it. You could always go into vertex mode, which is a little bit clearer, and box select like this to make sure you get the one underneath it as well. So I'll create another tile, but I'll use this one as a base. So back into object mode, Shift D to duplicate and move that across to the side here. Shift D because I want to edit the shape. Alt D is when you want a linked duplicate. So into edit mode with this one and maybe edit the shape here, move these slightly, move these across slightly, and these ones, and I've got a different shape. So I'll quickly do that a couple more times to show you the type of layout I'm looking for. So Shift D to duplicate, I'll rotate this one slightly, G to grab, and I'll scale it, but I'll press Shift Z so it doesn't get any thinner, so they're all the same thickness. And back to top view, into edit mode, and maybe adjust the shape slightly. So very simplistic, nice and basic, just changing the shape slightly. I'll use this one and Shift D to duplicate, and this one I'll keep it simple and just scale in the X to start with, so it's a bit flatter and thinner like this. Maybe rotate it round and place it into a position like this. And maybe one more, Shift D, duplicate, scale, Shift Z, so it's around here. And again, editing the shape, maybe this one be less beveled. So something like this. So I've got my tiles there, and I'll add those to a floor module eventually. But now's a good time to catch up with me and create some floor tiles like I have here. Pause the video and have a go at that. Okay, so I'll come back out of X-ray mode there, and I'll link this up to a floor module. So I'll duplicate this one, Shift D, and then X-4, so it comes over here. Go to top view and move my tiles over the top of it. So I'll deselect the base, G to grab, and move those somewhere around here. Maybe rotate them slightly. Oh, I've still got individual origins on, so I'll just turn that back to median point. So that's the middle point of all my objects, and press R to rotate, and just move those into the center. And when I join these together, I'll have a floor module with these tiles on that I can randomly place on my floor. What would be nice is to have another floor module with a different set of tiles to add even more variation across my floor. So before joining these together, I'm going to create a duplicate of them so I can edit them. So I'll select them all, Shift D to duplicate, X-4, so they're across to the side here, and then I can go in and start editing these tiles. So into edit mode, for example, I'll select all these, scale in the Y this time to make it sort of squashed like this and adapt the shape, or I could go into another one, into edit mode, into top view, and just start. Oh, make sure I'm in X-ray mode and select both those and start moving these around. I can also change the position slightly to create some variation this way, rotate them round slightly, and if I want to drastically change the shape of a tile, I'll go into edit mode and make some adjustments like this. Always remember, if you're scaling, to press Shift Z so you don't change the thickness of the tile. I might make this a bit more random and have one across over there and maybe one over there like this, just so it's not all in the middle like this one. So your challenge then is to create 3 different floor modules with tiles on like I've done here, and try and make them quite distinctive and random. Pause the video and have a go at that. Okay, so I'll make one more. I'll select these, Shift D, X-4 to create another tile across here, and I'll go in and make some adjustments. And I'll speed this up 3 times because it's things you've seen before. Maybe I'll delete a couple this time so there's much less tiles on this one. And again, try and make it a bit random like this. So there's my random tiles. I feel like this one's a bit uniform, so I'm going to just make a change on this and grab that one over to there like that and scale it down. So that's a bit more random. That's a bit better, I think. One last thing that would be nice to do is just to change the height very slightly of these. So just R to rotate so they're sticking up in different ways like this. You can move the camera around a little bit as well, just so it's rotating perpendicular to camera or in line with the camera, as you can see here. And I can just rotate some of these to make them a little bit less uniform. So just going around, doing a bit of rotation, and there we got some broken up tiles. Now before joining these together, I think it's a good idea to actually have these in the spares so I can easily go in and start adapting them if I want to. So I'll select all of them like this, Shift D and then Y-4 to bring them forward here, and then move these to the spares. And I'll just go to the spares and hide anything in there. That way I can easily get them back. I could even have a floor tiles collection within the spares if my scene were getting quite big and my spares had too many objects in. But I'm not going to worry too much about that at the moment. Now let's join these objects together. So I can select them all like this, but have a quick think about which module I need to select last. So we need to select the floor module last, so I can hold down Shift and click that again, and that will become the active object. Just be aware that if you do select objects like this, there's no active object. So you do have to Shift select one of the objects to make it active and therefore join 2. So I'll select these ones again, Shift select my floor module, and I'm choosing the floor module as the active object because that's got the origin point in the correct place for snapping. And I can now press Ctrl J to join. Same with the next one, select that floor last and Ctrl J to join, and the next one, select the floor last, Ctrl J to join. And now, let's come out of X-ray mode. In fact, I can start placing these into position within my room. So let's go to top view, G to grab, I turn snapping off, so I'll hold down Control for this one, and I'll turn snapping back on, G to grab, move that in position, and Alt D to start duplicating some of these. So I'll duplicate the blank one, and duplicate this one and rotate it 90 degrees. That way you can have a little bit of variation between your tiles, which are, in a sense, the same, just by rotating them 90 degrees. I'll select this one, back to top view and Alt D to put that into the corner, and just place these around the place like this. And now we've got a dungeon floor with some broken tiled modules. If I go up to the shading workspace, once we've shaded these, you can see that they're all going to link together really nicely. So hopefully you got an okay with that. As always, make sure you've saved your work, ready for next time. In this lecture, we'll be making the torch to light up our dungeon. Okay, so here's where we got up to last time, and I'll give you a quick challenge. I want you to add some materials to the floor. We've got 2 grey materials, so texture the tiles with one of the greys and the floor piece with the other grey. Pause the video and have a go at that. Okay, so hopefully you're finding this fairly straightforward now. With this object selected, I can start off by coming up to the top of the shader editor and clicking the drop down and choosing either of my grey materials. I'll choose the grey light because I think that's the material I'm going to texture the tiles with. And I chose the tiles as slot 1 because now it's easy to go into edit mode. I'll zoom in on my object with period key, Alt A to deselect all, into face mode with 3. So remember that's face mode up here. And I want to select that base tile. Now it's a little bit tricky to see, but if I come around to the top here, you can probably just see it just there. This again is easiest in X-ray mode up the top here. And now I can come across to the slots, create a new slot, assign this face to that slot. It immediately turns white because there's no material in this slot yet. So under the drop down, choose the grey material. And now we've got 2 materials on our objects, one for the tiles and one for the floor, which we can see nice and clearly over here in our linked duplicate. So I'll come back into object mode, choose the next one. I'll zoom in on this object with period key, and you could have done it the other way. Come up to the materials. This time I'll choose grey. So this is the floor, into edit mode, Alt A to deselect, and then I can press L to select linked. So it's all that tile, L over this one and L over this one. And then I can come up to the slots, create a new slot, assign those objects to it. And again, they turn white because there's no material in them. So I come up to the materials and choose the grey light. So that's the reverse way to do it. And back into object mode, and we've textured that floor tile. I'll quickly do the last of our tiled floors here. So I'll add the grey light, and also just to show that you can do this in a different order, I'll come up to the slots and add a new slot. Even though I'm not in edit mode, I've still got 2 slots on my object. It's not making any difference because I haven't assigned any faces. So now I go into edit mode, Alt A to deselect all. I'll just select this middle tile and assign that to the second slot. Again, it turns white because there's no material in it, and choose the grey for slot 2. So there's all my pieces with tiles on. Now I can select a floor module with no tiles on and just come up and select the grey. And because they're all linked duplicates, they all update and our floor is looking great. So hopefully you got an okay with that. Okay, so now I'm going to make the torch. And what I'm going to challenge you to do is to make the body of the torch, not the flame. And I want you to do this by yourself, looking at the torch model here and how I've made it. And I started off with a cylinder of 8 sides. You might want to save your work here and just have a go at that. And then you can always come back to this point and follow along with me if it goes wrong. So pause the video and have a go at that. Okay, so for this, I'll go back to the layout workspace, and my 3D cursor is right in the center of the scene. So I can press Shift A to add, mesh, cylinder, and I'll change it to 8 vertices and press enter. I'll zoom in on that with period key. The reason I choose 8 is if we ever wanted to add a mirror, I could easily mirror it along the X and the Y because the number of sides is divisible by 4. So I could work on this corner here and it will update on the other 3. So it's always a good idea when you add a cylinder to make it divisible by 4 where possible, then you can mirror along both the X and the Y. So now I'll scale this down to somewhere around here and S to scale in the Z, and this will be the handle. I'll go into edit mode now, and let's zoom in again on my object. I'm in face mode, so come around to the bottom and scale down the base here. So this is the handle section. Now there is a kind of bracket around the middle. I prefer to model the whole handle first and then do the bracket. So if I press Ctrl R and do 2 loop cuts now by using the wheel of my mouse and then double left click to set those, I can bring them in slightly, so select that top bracket there with Alt left click, GG to edge slide. Oh, and note, I've still got snapping on, so I'll just turn that off, just so it's a little bit simpler. I could see it jumping down grid distances. That's how I was able to tell I still had snapping on. And I'll select the bottom one, GG to edge slide. Now that's a bit smoother. So somewhere around here. And then 3 to go to face mode. And then select the face loop going around by Alt left clicking on one of the edges going across the face loop like this. And E to extrude, scale, Shift Z, and I've created a bracket like this. Now I create that second because I want to keep this nice straight line here. If this was my starting point, this cylinder here, and then I took the top face there and extruded it outwards this way, and then extruded it upwards again, and then inset it and pulled it inwards, and then extruded upwards, the top might have had a funny kink in it being a different size. Hopefully that makes sense, and it doesn't make too much difference if you did it that way. It's not a big problem. Anyway, I'll continue with the top face, and this time I'll extrude it out and scale. So it comes out like this, and G to grab in the Z and pull it upwards. So there's a slight slope upwards to the top section, E to extrude, and I'll scale that out slightly, and I to inset to bring it in, E to extrude and pull that downwards to around here, and I'll just scale that in slightly so it follows the inward slope here. So we've got a sort of torch shape, so hopefully you got an okay with that. If you struggled at all, then do pause the video here and catch up with me. You can of course modify this shape in any way. Perhaps you want to make it longer. We can then select the bottom face. I'll come to front view for this and G to grab and pull it downwards in the Z axis. But you can see as I do that, it does lose that diagonal slope inwards down here. So we'd have to scale that in and roughly line it up. Some edits are simpler than others. Let's say I wanted to change the bracket position, probably easiest in X-ray mode, and select these faces here, G to grab in the Z. But again, you can see the change in the distortion it's making on that downward slope. And I can adjust this slightly to bring it back into position, perhaps somewhere around there. So it does help to get the outline shape first and then start adding the details in second, so you don't have to make these big adjustments. I might do the same with the top and make it slightly bigger, so G then Z, and have a bigger top piece and scale that up slightly there. And there's my torch. I'll come back out of X-ray mode. And lastly, remember you can select face loops like this and let's say scale them up, but press Shift Z if you wanted to, let's say make that top section bigger. So Shift Z so it doesn't scale in the Z axis. That would mean I would need to select this inside face loop there and again scale Shift Z to bring that out into that sort of shape like this. Okay, so let's make the flame. Now we know we want the flame to come out of the top here. So with my face loop selected around the middle here, remember you press Alt left click on one of the edges going across your face loop. I can press Shift S to move my 3D cursor to selected. So cursor to selected there, and that will move it into position where I can start my flame. So I'll go into object mode now to make sure the flame's a separate object. We will actually join it to this object eventually. It's just a little bit easier because it's faster to isolate the shape if we model it as a separate object and then join it later. So Shift A to add, mesh, and then again I'll choose a cylinder, just zoom out just a touch. And again I'll choose 8, so it's nice and low poly, and we can use that mirror if we actually wanted to. And I'll scale it right down to somewhere around here. I'll just bring it up slightly, so G to grab to around here. And let's start editing the shape by going into edit mode with tab and zoom in a touch. I'll select this top face and scale it up. So it's a nice big flame, E to extrude, scale it in, and E to extrude again, and scale 0 so it comes into a point like this, and press enter. Now because I've got auto merge vertices, they should all become one vertex. So if I go to vertex mode now, I'll press Alt A to deselect all, and then select that vert again to make sure that it is one single vert. So now I can select, let's say this edge loop here, by Alt left clicking, G to grab and move that off to the side, and we've got a sort of flame. It's a bit fat as a flame, so I can select all with A and scale Shift Z so it doesn't scale in the Z. That's a bit nicer. And then scale Z so we scale it upwards in the Z to somewhere around there, and that's looking quite nice. If you wanted to add a bit more complexity to this, we can select an edge loop like this again and Control B to bevel, and it can have a bit more of a curve like this. I can even use my wheel to create another edge loop like this, so it's got a bit more of a flow to it. I could do the same down the bottom here as well, so Control B to bevel. I'll move my wheel down because I don't want to create too many loop cuts, and that looks about right. I could also G to grab and maybe create more of a flame like this. That's entirely up to you, so it's a bit more of a flicker. Or if I undo that, you can have a nice simple flame like this. It's a little bit flat this way, so I'll select that middle edge loop there. I'll come to proportional editing here, so turn that on, G to grab, and remember I've got my circle of influence, and I can use the wheel to affect how large that is, and I can use that to grab it and pull it around, but even better I can use it to rotate as well and bring the circle of influence in like this, and it can create more of a curve such as this if you want. I could also come to the top here and create more of a twist to it like this, and then G to grab and pull it across like this. That creates quite an interesting look as well. So going to the top and pressing R to rotate creates quite an interesting effect as well. Okay, so back into object mode, and there's our flame, maybe a touch bigger, somewhere around here. We can always scale it down when we put it onto the wall later. So your last challenge then is to create the flame, and I also want you to texture both the flame and the handle in the way I've textured it just here. So pause the video and have a go at that. Okay, so back across to the shading workspace, period key to zoom in onto my object, and with the flame selected, I'll create a new material, and we'll give that an emission, so a nice sort of yellowy color. So bring the brightness up, cross to the yellows, somewhere over here, and the emission strength up a bit. Now remember, we don't see much of an emission in our viewport because I've got to turn the bloom on, and then it has that sort of glow to it. But I'll talk more a bit about lighting later on, so just leaving it like that for the moment is fine. Let's work on our handle. So I'll come to my material drop down here, and I'll choose the brown wood, and I want a new texture slot. So add a new texture slot, and this is going to be the metal top and bracket. So I'll choose the metal for this, so metal grey. I notice I'm doing this in a slightly different order. I've added the material first, but I haven't assigned my faces yet. So I can come into edit mode, and I want to select those faces. So 3 to go to face mode, select all those top faces, and select the middle faces as well by holding down shift and box selecting, up to our material slots and assign. Back into object mode, and we've got our torch. So hopefully you got an okay with that. Make sure you've saved your work, ready for next time. In this lecture, we'll be looking at lighting our dungeon and remind ourselves of the differences between Eevee and Cycles. Okay, so here's where we got up to last time, and I need to join my flame to my torch, and I can start positioning it in my dungeon. So I'll select the flame and the torch body last. I think that's going to be the best. In the shading workspace, we can't actually see the object origins. As you can see, when I click these, there's no orange dot. If we go up to the overlays up the top here and click on the drop down, we have origins unticked there. So I can tick that so I can see my origins. The reason they have it unticked is so it's not distracting, but I think it's helpful to have it there. And I think the object origin that's preferable is the one on the torch rather than the flame for rotating it. So I'll select the flame first and the torch last, making it the active object, and Ctrl J to join. I can then come across and relabel this torch. And it's worth saying that I now have 3 material slots. If I come up to my slots up the top here, I've got my brown material, my metal grey, and also my emission. I'll actually relabel this. So I'll click on it, come to the material name, and rename it flame, so it's more obvious. And now let's think about putting it into position. So I'll scroll out a bit and probably put it against this wall here. So G to grab in the X-axis going across this way until it roughly lines up with the wall there. And it's probably a bit simpler in top view. So let's move that into position there. Zoom in on that object with period key and move it upwards. Let's just align it slightly so it's propped up against the wall. So R then Y, and just angle it slightly like this. And again, G then X to move it a little bit closer to the wall. Just about there, I think. Might want to make it a touch smaller, so scale it down a little bit and just up a little bit there. I could have a connection to the wall if we wanted, but I don't think it's particularly necessary. I think from about here, it looks quite nice. One last thing, if I zoom in on my object with period key again, the flame is coming out at an angle. It should be going upright. So I can go back into edit mode, Alt A to deselect all, and L to select my flame. Now I've still got proportional edit on, so if I press R to rotate now, it will rotate the top of my torch. So I'll undo that and turn proportional edit off, and now R, Y to rotate in the Y axis. I'll just come around here slightly and G to grab, move that into position. So it makes a little bit more sense there. And maybe G, then X to move it very slightly closer to the wall. Okay, so pause the video here and catch up with me. Join your torch and flame together. Remember to rename the object and the flame material and put it against your wall like this. And lastly, you may want to adjust the flame. So pause the video and have a go at that. Okay, so what happens when we go across to rendered view? So up the top here, rendered mode, we can see our torch there. It's not really doing much though. Even with the bloom on, we can try turning up the emission strength, and that just makes the bloom a little bit brighter. But as hopefully you remember, when we're in the Eevee renderer, the emission value doesn't actually give off light into our scene. If I change this across to Cycles, you can see that it's now offering light into our scene. I could turn this up a fair bit more to something like 50, and suddenly we're getting a bit more light in that area. Most of our light, however, is coming from our light over here. I'm going to delete that for now, so we can see a really dark, dingy dungeon, lit very slightly by the background, but mainly by this torch. If I change back to Eevee now, we just get that bloom, we don't get any of the light from the object. So again, that emission is not actually giving off light when we're in Eevee. But of course, if we go back to cycles, we have all this noise and it takes a while to render. I can obviously speed that up with my GPU. If you've got a powerful GPU, you can turn that on, and I can turn on denoise here as well. And you can see it clears up that noise, but it's still taking a while to update when I move around my scene. And I've got a particularly powerful graphics card in my machine, so this is going relatively quickly. So for this section, we'll work in Eevee because, like I say, it's much faster, updates instantly, and it should be the same on almost any computer that runs Blender. However, how do we solve the light problem? Well, we can actually add in a light source. So I'll click on my torch and hold down Shift S to bring up my pie menu and select Cursor to Selected. And now my 3D cursor moves to the selected object. Now I'll press Shift A to add, come down to light and choose a point light. I'll zoom in on that and we can see that point light lighting up this area. And what I'll do, I'll move that up so it's right on top of my flame just there. I'll select my light properties down here and I can change the color to make it more like the flame. So bring it across to the yellow and suddenly it's looking a bit more like the light is coming from the flame. And I can turn the power up fairly high, something like 95, something close to 100. And suddenly our dungeon is lit by this torchlight here. Now just a note, if I zoom in once again on that object, if I bring the radius down to 0, that means it's a tiny little light that's sitting inside our flame, and therefore the light is blocked by the flame object. But as soon as I turn it up, I make it a bit bigger, and the default is 0.25, the light is emitting from outside the flame and therefore isn't being blocked by it. So take a moment to catch up with me and add in a point light, place it within your flame, and give it a nice yellowy orangey color and a power of around 100. Pause the video and have a go at that. Now we can't actually join the light to the flame and the torch, so whenever we duplicate it we will have to select the light and the torch at the same time and duplicate them both at the same time with Alt D. But before we do that, let's move them into a new collection. So M to move to new collection, and torches. Press OK. Now I'm going to start duplicating them and putting them into position. So 7 to go to top view. I'm going to press Alt D to duplicate in the Y-axis and move that to the other wall down here. Now I used Alt D because let's say I want to change one of the lights. So I'll select one of the lights here and increase the brightness. It will update on all of them. I'll turn that back to around 100. So I think that's a bit more gloomy and dingy and more fun. And I'll duplicate it across the other side. And they can be a little bit awkward to select. So you can just box select and control box select to remove a selection of an object. I'll go back to top view, Alt D, move it across to this side. I'll just zoom in on that with period key. And obviously it's slanted the wrong way. So I'll R, Z, 180 to rotate it round and G then X to move that closer to the wall like this. And we've got this fun looking dungeon now. Now at the moment our background is a dark grey, so it's not offering much light into our scene, which you may want. But let's take a closer look at our background by coming to the shader editor up the top left here, click on the drop down where it says object and change it to world. And our background is this dark grey colour here. If I bring that all the way to black, you can see we've only got those lights and it's very atmospheric, which works quite nicely. However, that can be a bit too extreme, and often a good idea is to change your background color by clicking on the color, give it a little bit more brightness, and maybe come across to the blues slightly. That way it still looks quite dark, but it does give some light into your scene, and therefore you can see a bit more detail in your objects. So again, if I come across to the background, if I make this a bit brighter, you can see the lights are still offering something in terms of atmosphere, but we can see a bit more of our model. This is probably a bit too light, so maybe a little bit lower, somewhere around there looks about right. This is very much a matter of preference, and some of you might like to go all the way down to the dark, dingy depths of the blackness there. But I'll bring it back up a little bit more. I must admit I do quite like the dark, but maybe just a little bit away from the blacks there, so we can see a bit more of the detail in our models, somewhere around there. Okay, so the last thing for you to do then is to make sure you're happy with the lights in this particular room, and to play with the background color and the tone of that background color, so how bright it is, to get the right atmosphere for your scene. Once you've done that, make sure you've saved your work, ready for next time. In this lecture, we'll be completing the dungeon layout, and we'll be talking a little bit about how you can adapt your modules to make sure they fit. So here's where we got up to last time, and I'm going to go back to the layout workspace to work on my dungeon. I'll zoom out and move to a position where I can see most of my dungeon like this. And I'm going to press N on my keyboard to remove that side panel, so I've got a nice lot of space to work in. Also, you may have noticed there's a timeline window at the bottom here. We can also get rid of that by coming to the corner here, left click and drag to make this window full size, as it were. So we're in a good position now where we can start building our dungeon. First of all, I'll do a tiny bit of organization. So I'll bring down the outliner, I'll minimize the spares and the torches for now. I'll bring back the pillars, and I want to move those across to the side so they're not interfering with the walls here. If I press Alt-A to deselect all, I can right-click on a collection and select objects. So that's selected these 3 pillars, and I can press G to grab in the X to move those across, and hold down Control to turn snapping back on, so they're definitely still on the grid. Let's go to top view and again line those up. I'll select this one. I'll actually turn on snapping this time and move that across so they're all next to each other like this. Let's just quickly look and see where my other objects are. So I've got all my planes here, which are my floor tiles. I need to put those into a collection, so M to move to new collection and call them floor and press OK. And I can minimize that for the moment. I've also got my crate and my barrel there as well. And I'll deselect the floor tiles. Now what you may want to do is have a spare torch over on the side here that you can always grab and duplicate. And the same with each floor tile, but I don't think it matters too much to always select them from here and just duplicate them from this area. So we don't have to have a set off at the side like this. What I'm noticing as well is that there are a few objects that are in the main collection and probably need a collection of their own. So we've got the end door modules here. So I'll select both those, move to new collection and doorways. And because we're going to be copying the barrels and the crates over and over, I'll put each of those into their own barrel and crate collection. M to move to new collection, barrel, and the same with the crate. So pause the video here and catch up with me, making sure that your scene is organized in a reasonable way. It doesn't have to be exactly the same as mine. You might have different names, and you might want to experiment with a different collection system that suits you. But just make sure you're in a nice position to start off building more of a complete dungeon. Pause the video and have a go at that. Okay, so we're almost there, but we will actually need to create a few more modules out of what we've already got. And it's fairly easy and doesn't take too long, but it does need a bit of thought. So I'll come to top view and I'll select this wall here and duplicate it for a corridor down here. So Alt-D, and I've got snapping turned on so I can move that in position, R90, and we're comfortably there. And let's say it's a 2 floor moduled corridor. So I could even select a floor module, Alt-D, move that into position here, and maybe another one there, Alt-D, this one, Alt-D, duplicate this, and these 2, Alt-D, and move them across to the side. So we're ready for a new room. However, we've got 2 pillars either side, and our doorway module already has a pillar on it. So if I duplicate this, Alt-D, Shift-Z, so it doesn't move in the Z axis, and move that across, you can see we've got some Z fighting there, where 2 pillars are on top of each other. Now actually, if I go to Material Preview mode, you won't actually be able to see the issue, but it's bad practice and you might get a bit of flicker in some game engines. So I'll go back to solid mode, and what we'll need to do is delete the pillar from this object. So I'll go into local view with / on my numpad, and at the moment I can't make any changes to this without affecting the others because I used Alt-D to duplicate, so it's a linked duplicate. So I need to make this a single user. Just have a quick think, how do I make this a single user? So you may have remembered that we come up to Object, under Relations, Make Single User, Object and Data. Now I can go into Edit mode with Tab and Alt-A to deselect all, L to select the end pillar, and delete faces. Now let's come back out of isolation mode and back out of edit mode, and you can see we've got a doorway module. Now it's very slightly different because I've got this pillar at the end instead of this one, but it could be a different room, but it doesn't really make a lot of difference. And I could easily swap this panel out for this one here, I think, with that pillar on it. So that's not really a big issue. But it does show that every now and again you'll need to think of a different module or adapt a module slightly so that it fits in a similar way to this. You may also find you'll have to adapt a wall module like this, so the same rules apply. I can press Shift-D to duplicate, so it's not a linked duplicate, so it doesn't move in the Z axis, and bring it across to the side. And then again, I can go into local view, into edit mode, Alt-A to deselect all, L to select the end pillar and delete faces. Back into object mode and back out of isolation mode, and I've got a wall panel there with no pillars in case I need it. It does kind of all depend on your dungeon design and how you build it, but you should be in a position now where you can build a full dungeon. So pause the video here and catch up with me and create a short corridor with a doorway at the end. And with that doorway, I want you to adapt that module, so delete its pillar. Pause the video and have a go at that. Okay, so at this point, you can start creating your dungeon. I'll just do one more room to show you the types of things you can do. So if I go to top view, I could select all of these and box select these ones, Alt D to duplicate, bring them down to here. And of course I will need to modify these ones here. So I can select that one and delete, and this one has an extra pillar. So I can delete that and bring this panel into here. Do of course also remember that you might want to adapt this in some way, maybe move the floor tiles so it's not exactly the same, or you could even delete these and select these, G to grab in the Y, and create a shorter room quite easily. And just for the sake of being organized, I'll press G to grab and move that into position. And this torch here, I'll go to top view, G to grab, and I'll move it into here. Let's go to rendered view and see what we've got. We've got a really interesting looking dungeon now. So pause the video here and have a bit of fun creating a dungeon layout. Okay, lastly, I'll quickly go back into solid mode and just quickly think about the crates and barrels. I'll go into local view with this object and zoom out just a touch. And it's probably the case that you'll want to create maybe a collection of crates. So if I press Alt D and move this across the side, and at this point I'll turn snapping off because I want to create a little bit of non-uniformity within these. I may also want to RZ 180 to give some variation to my barrels as well. And let's say Alt D Z1 to move it up, and just move that on top of the other ones like this. And again, RZ 90 this time, and just randomly move it in the Z axis to create some crates like this. Now we could select them all and join them together and create a module like this. Or if I come out of isolation mode, I could move these into position. So I'll press Alt D for that, move them into position around here, and then select them again, Alt D, move them into position, and just adapt them slightly so they are different. So you can see there, it's got some variation, so there's no real need to join them together as a module. So I'll quickly do the same thing for the barrel, moving it around and rotating it so it's different, and maybe stacking them up if I feel so inclined. And I'll just move that across the side so it's not interfering with the others, and then Alt D and move those into position somewhere around here, and maybe put some in the other room, so Alt D around about there, and another load here, but this time I'll delete a few, and we've got a bit of variation in our dungeon. So pause the video here and move about some barrels and crates within your dungeon. Lastly then is rendering. Now some of you may have noticed that I accidentally copied a camera whilst creating the second room. So if I press 0 on my numpad, it goes to the primary camera, and that's indicated by this icon here being surrounded by a beveled square. So I can click on this camera here, and that becomes the primary camera, and back to this one here. And if I were to delete this camera, that would bring me out of camera mode, and then when I press 0 again, the other one becomes the primary camera. And when rendering, you would render through the primary camera that has been selected in this way. So if for any reason you copy a camera or anything like that, just be aware of that feature. Now if I select the camera, and I'll press N to bring up my toolbars, go to view and lock camera to view just here, and press N to get rid of the toolbar, and I'll just move it so I can see most of my room. So at the moment I can hardly see any of my room, but if I go backwards at all, I come out of my room. So I'll come forwards again. So with my camera selected, I'll bring up my properties here, and down at the bottom I've got my object data properties, and it's got a camera icon. This is where I can change some of my camera attributes, such as the focal length, for example. If I bring this right down, I get a really nice wide angle, which I can take a shot of one of my rooms. A wider angle tends to kind of distort objects slightly as they go into the perspective. I would suggest something like 25mm is about right. If I come into the corner here, it doesn't distort features too much. You could possibly go down to 20 as well if you want to. Another thing you might notice is you've got clipping start and end. Now if I come right out to here, and let's say I've got a big dungeon and I want to show the whole scene, can you see how it's disappearing in the distance? And the further I go out, the more it disappears until it's completely disappeared. Well, that's the clipping end. And if I turn this up to something like 1000, everything comes back. Incidentally, you might notice this in the viewport as well. If I press 0 to come out of camera view and start zooming out, you can see it slowly disappears and everything's disappeared. If I press N on my keyboard, under view, we have the clipping end here, and I can change this and put it up as I see fit. So back to camera view. The other thing you might want to do when you're zoomed out like this is have a narrower focal length. It changes it so it becomes a bit more like an orthographic view. As you can see, the perspective going way off into the distance. And a focal length of something like 85, even up to something like 100, can be quite nice for more of an orthographic look. You can actually change your perspective to orthographic, but it becomes a little bit awkward to control, and I think just keeping it on perspective but bringing up the focal length is a better option. So when you've got a nice wide shot like this, a narrow focal length, so a higher number here is better. And when you're into your rooms, taking shots of your rooms, you want a wide angle lens and therefore a low number in your focal length. So the last thing for you to do then is to render your scene, render out some shots of the insides of the rooms, and also take a nice wide shot like this. Do remember about clipping, and remember to change the focal length depending on your distance. Once you've done that, make sure you've saved your work, and you might want to share your work with the community to get some feedback and check out how other people are getting on. Hopefully you enjoyed making your dungeon. As an extension task to push your skills that bit further, you could try making a few different objects to add to your dungeon. I have a video on making a low poly sword, which will go nicely. You can find that on my YouTube channel. Or maybe look at the low poly dungeon packs online to see what others have made, and look at those for ideas and have a go at maybe making some of those objects yourself. You could experiment with different coloured lights for different areas, make different walls and floor tiles for different areas, and as always I would encourage you to share your outcomes with us on the community and social media. So when you're ready, follow me to the next section where we'll be creating the dinosaur you see on the front cover of this course.